Imagine this. A sunny afternoon in the heart of Brookhaven turns into a moment of reckoning. A young black teenager, Marcus, faces unwarranted aggression from a police officer who believes him guilty of a crime he didn't commit. What happens next not only changes the lives of those involved, but ignites a nationwide conversation about racial bias, authority, and justice. This story isn't just about one boy or one officer. It's about the systems we live in and the choices we make. If you've ever wondered how compassion and accountability can reshape our world, this tale is for you. Stay tuned and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's reflect together. Write something inspiring like, "I choose to see everyone with love and fairness." Let's spread positivity. The year was 2024. Brookhaven, a bustling city known for its historical landmarks and thriving arts community, was also grappling with a darker truth: a police department plagued by accusations of racial bias. Marcus Reynolds, a 16-year-old with a promising future and dreams of becoming a civil rights attorney, was no stranger to these issues. His father, Police Chief William Reynolds, had spent years advocating for reforms within the system, yet the battle seemed uphill. On a crisp October afternoon, Marcus decided to walk to a nearby convenience store. Dressed in his favorite hoodie and sneakers, he hummed to himself, mentally rehearsing for his debate team's upcoming competition. The neighborhood he strolled through was a mix of historic charm and urban sprawl. But for Marcus, it was home, a place he felt safe. Meanwhile, Officer James Carter, a 28-year-old rookie, was on patrol. Carter had recently graduated from the academy and carried with him the nervous energy of someone eager to prove themselves. That day, a call had come through dispatch about a reported robbery. The suspect was described vaguely: a young black male wearing dark clothing. Carter's pulse quickened. Eager to make an arrest, he scanned the area and spotted Marcus walking down the street. Without hesitation, Carter pulled his cruiser to the curb and stepped out, calling, "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Startled, Marcus turned around. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone polite but confused. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," Carter responded curtly. His eyes scanned Marcus's clothing, his posture, his hands. Everything seemed harmless, but the officer's implicit biases filled in blanks where logic should have prevailed. Marcus raised his hand slightly, a reflex learned from countless stories of encounters gone wrong. "I've just been at home studying. I'm headed to the store," he explained, his voice steady but wary. Carter's hand hovered over his holster. "Turn out your pockets," he demanded. Marcus complied, pulling out a phone and a wallet. "That's all I have." The interaction might have de-escalated there, but Carter's focus was unwavering. He didn't see a teenager, he saw a potential suspect. The tension in the air thickened as Marcus tried to reason with him. "Officer, I didn't do anything wrong. Can I call my father?" Before Marcus could finish, Carter reached for his pepper spray. The officer's fear, misplaced and unchecked, drove his actions. Marcus winced as the chemical burned his eyes and face. He fell to the ground, gasping for air and crying out in pain. A bystander, a middle-aged woman named Clara Jenkins, witnessed the scene and began recording on her phone. Her voice trembled with anger as she shouted, "What are you doing? That boy didn't do anything." The confrontation had lasted mere minutes, but its impact was immediate and devastating. Marcus lay on the sidewalk, disoriented and humiliated, as the echoes of Clara's protests filled the street. Officer Carter, realizing the commotion he'd caused, tried to justify his actions to the small crowd that had gathered. "He fits the description," Carter insisted, though his voice wavered. Clara retorted, "A description as vague as young and black? You think that's enough to assault a kid?" Marcus, still struggling to regain his composure, managed to whisper, "Please, call my dad, William Reynolds." The name sent a jolt through Clara, who immediately dialed the number Marcus provided. It wasn't long before Chief William Reynolds arrived at the scene. Wearing his badge and civilian clothes, he pushed through the crowd, his face a mix of concern and fury. "What happened here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Officer Carter stiffened. "Sir, But the chief raised a hand to silence him. Kneeling beside Marcus, he examined his son's red, swollen face. "Marcus," he said softly, "I'm here. It's going to be okay." Turning to Carter, Chief Reynolds asked, "Did you even check his ID? Ask for his story? Or did you decide guilt based on his skin color and a vague description?" The rookie stammered. "I thought he fit the thought," Chief Reynolds interrupted. "Your job is to know, to assess, to serve and protect, not to act on assumptions." The crowd murmured their agreement. Clara stepped forward, holding up her phone. "I recorded everything, Chief. The way he treated your son was unacceptable." The gravity of the situation began to dawn on Carter. His actions weren't just a misjudgment. They were a glaring example of systemic issues that Chief Reynolds had fought against for years. The chief turned back to his son, his heart heavy with the realization that even his position couldn't shield his family from prejudice. As Chief Reynolds confronts Officer Carter, the story takes a dramatic turn. How will the chief balance his roles as a father and a leader in the department? What consequences will Carter face? And how will this incident ignite change in Brookhaven? Stay with us to uncover the layers of this unfolding narrative. And remember, justice starts with accountability. What do you think about this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge and inspire. Chief Reynolds stood amidst the gathering crowd, his eyes a mix of simmering anger and deep disappointment. His son Marcus still sat on the pavement, clutching his burning eyes, struggling to regain his composure. A paramedic arrived, summoned by a bystander, and began treating Marcus, who winced at the sting of the saline solution flushing his face. The chief's focus, however, was now fully on Officer Carter, whose expression had shifted from defensive indignation to pale-faced dread. "Officer Carter," Reynolds began, his voice level but cold, "explain to me exactly what happened here." Carter hesitated, his hand twitching toward his belt as if his badge could somehow shield him from the scrutiny. "Sir, I was responding to a call about a robbery suspect. The description was vague, but this individual," he gestured toward Marcus, "matched what I was told. When he didn't comply immediately, I had to act." "Didn't comply?" The chief's voice rose slightly, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. He gestured toward Marcus, who was now sitting up but visibly shaken. "Does this look like a threat to you? Did you give him time to explain? Did you check his identification, search for witnesses, or even use common sense?" Carter opened his mouth but faltered. He hadn't done any of those things. The weight of the moment pressed down on him as the crowd's stares burned into him. Chief Reynolds continued, his voice now carrying the full authority of his position. "This is my son, Officer Carter, and whether he's my child or a complete stranger, your conduct is unacceptable. You used unnecessary force based on a description so broad it could fit half the city's population. You chose to escalate rather than de-escalate, and now you've left a teenager traumatized." Carter's throat tightened. "Sir, I didn't know he was your son." Reynolds interrupted, his voice like steel. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't know, and you didn't care to find out. Your actions were reckless and rooted in bias. This isn't just about Marcus. It's about every person who's faced this kind of treatment simply because of the color of their skin." As the chief spoke, Clara stepped forward again. "Chief, I've got the entire incident on video. It shows everything," Marcus trying to explain, Carter reaching for the pepper spray before even asking questions. "People need to see this." Reynolds nodded grimly. "Send it to me. This isn't staying buried." The air was electric with tension as the chief turned back to Carter. "You are relieved of duty effective immediately, pending an investigation. Hand over your badge and weapon." Carter hesitated, his face flushed with embarrassment. But the sight of Marcus's tear-streaked face and the crowd's collective gaze left him no room to argue. Slowly, he removed his badge and holster, handing them to Reynolds. The chief took a deep breath, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. He had always known the system he worked within was flawed, but to see his own son fall victim to its failures was a bitter pill to swallow. Turning to the crowd, he addressed them directly. "I know many of you are angry, and you have every right to be. This incident is unacceptable. And I promise it will not be swept under the rug. We must hold each other accountable, not just as officers of the law, but as human beings." His words struck a chord. The crowd, initially bristling with outrage, began to soften, their murmurs turning to nods of agreement. Clara spoke up again. "Chief, this isn't just about Officer Carter. It's about the whole system. How many more kids have to go through this before things change?" Reynolds nodded solemnly. "You're right. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a much larger problem. And change starts here." Marcus, now able to see more clearly, stood up with his father's help. His voice was steady despite his ordeal. "Dad, this happens to people who don't have a police chief for a father. What about them? How do we make sure this stops?" The question hung in the air, a challenge not just to his father, but to the entire crowd. Reynolds placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a quiet acknowledgement of his son's bravery. "We start by exposing the truth," he said, "and then we fight for reform together." As the dust begins to settle, Chief Reynolds must navigate the fallout from this incident while keeping his promise to seek justice and reform. How will the community respond to his actions? And can one man truly change a broken system from within? Don't miss the next chapter of this compelling story of accountability and transformation. Comment below. How do you believe we can create a more just and equitable society? And don't forget to subscribe to join us in uncovering more powerful stories like this one. The evening air was heavy with tension as Chief William Reynolds sat in his office, staring at the video Clara Jenkins had sent him. It was damning. Every second of footage showed Officer Carter's missteps, his quick assumptions, his lack of patience, and ultimately, his reckless use of force. Marcus's face, contorted in pain, filled the screen, a visual reminder of what Reynolds had fought against his entire career. Yet, here it was, staring back at him, a stark reminder that systemic change was easier said than done. The knock on his office door broke his train of thought. "Come in," he called, his voice weary. Marcus entered, his face still slightly red from the pepper spray, but calmer now. He carried a cup of tea, setting it gently on his father's desk. "Mom said you haven't eaten. Thought this might help," Marcus said softly. Reynolds managed a tired smile. "Thanks, son." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down. We need to talk." Marcus obeyed, his eyes searching his father's face for clues to what was coming. "Marcus," Reynolds began, leaning forward, "what happened today should never have occurred, not to you, not to anyone. And while I'm doing everything in my power to hold Carter accountable, I need you to understand something." Marcus straightened, his expression growing more serious. "What is it?" The chief hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "What happened to you isn't just about one officer making a mistake. It's about a culture that allows assumptions to replace facts. It's about fear being disguised as vigilance. And it's about the systemic flaws I've been trying to fix since before you were born." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. "So what now? You suspended Carter. But what happens next?" "People are angry, Dad. They're not just going to let this go." Reynolds sighed deeply. "They shouldn't. I've called a press conference for tomorrow. I'm going to address the incident publicly. We need transparency. And we need to acknowledge that this department and departments across the country have a long way to go." Marcus tilted his head, studying his father's face. "Do you think they'll listen? Or will they just see this as another promise with no action?" The question hit hard. Reynolds knew the skepticism was justified. Too many times, leaders had made grand statements only to fall short on real change. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we have to try. And I'm counting on you to help me keep this department accountable. Your voice matters, Marcus, more than ever." The conversation was interrupted by another knock. This time, it was Deputy Chief Elena Morales, her expression grim. "Sir, the media's already caught wind of the story. It's all over the local news." She handed him her tablet, the screen displaying headlines: "Police Chief's Son, Pepper Sprayed by Rookie Officer," and "Racial Bias in Brookhaven Police Force Exposed." Reynolds rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Thank you, Morales. I'll address this tomorrow." As she left, Marcus leaned forward. "Do you think they'll paint you as biased because it's me? Reynolds shook his head. The truth is the truth, Marcus. And if people want to challenge my objectivity, I'll meet them with facts. This isn't just about you, it's about a culture that needs to change. The next morning, the press conference drew a sizable crowd. Journalists, activists, and concerned citizens packed the room, their expressions a mix of curiosity and expectation. Cameras flashed as Chief Reynolds stepped to the podium, his uniform crisp, but his face somber. Marcus stood at the back of the room, watching his father intently. "Good morning," Reynolds began, his voice steady despite the nerves tightening his chest. "I am here today not just as the chief of police, but as a father and a member of this community. Yesterday, an incident occurred that exemplifies the very issues our department and law enforcement as a whole must address." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "My son, Marcus Reynolds, was wrongfully detained and pepper sprayed by one of our officers. The officer in question acted on assumptions rather than evidence, and his actions were unacceptable. Effective immediately, he has been relieved of duty pending a thorough investigation." The room buzzed with murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Reynolds raised a hand for silence. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that has allowed biases to fester unchecked. It's about a lack of accountability and a need for meaningful reform. As chief, I take full responsibility for addressing these issues within our department." Clara Jenkins, seated near the front, raised her hand. "Chief Reynolds, what specific steps will you take to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Reynolds nodded, expecting the question. "First, we're implementing mandatory bias training for all officers, starting immediately. Second, we're establishing a civilian oversight committee to review incidents of misconduct and ensure transparency. Finally, we will be revisiting our use of force policies to prioritize de-escalation and accountability." Another reporter stood. "Do you believe your son's case will set a precedent for how similar cases are handled?" Reynolds met the question head-on. "I hope so. This case should serve as a reminder that no one, regardless of rank or status, is above accountability. And it should push us all to demand better from those sworn to protect and serve." As the press conference wrapped up, Marcus approached his father. "You did good up there," he said quietly. Reynolds gave him a small smile. "It's a start. But the real work begins now." As the community reacts to Chief Reynolds' bold stance, tensions continue to rise. Will his proposed reforms lead to lasting change? Or will resistance within the department threaten his efforts? And how will Marcus find his own voice in this battle for justice? Stay with us as the story unfolds. Share your thoughts. How can communities and law enforcement rebuild trust? Let's talk in the comments below. The sun was setting over Brookhaven, casting long shadows across the city streets as small groups of residents began gathering in the town square. Word of Chief Reynolds' press conference had spread rapidly, and the community was buzzing with conversations about reform, accountability, and the need for action. While some praised the chief's transparency, others questioned whether his promises would lead to tangible change. The divide mirrored the larger tensions gripping the nation, a clash between hope and skepticism that had grown louder with each instance of injustice. Marcus walked silently beside his father as they approached the square. The hum of voices grew louder, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Signs bobbed above the crowd, their messages ranging from justice for all to end racial profiling now. Despite the peaceful tone, there was an undercurrent of urgency, an unspoken demand for results rather than rhetoric. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked, glancing up at his father. Reynolds nodded, his jaw tight. "This isn't just about me. It's about showing people that their voices matter and proving that we can change." As they reached the edge of the crowd, the chief spotted a makeshift stage where community leaders had begun speaking. Clara Jenkins was among them, her commanding presence drawing applause as she detailed her experience recording the incident with Marcus. She held up her phone, the device now a symbol of accountability, and addressed the crowd. "This," she said, her voice ringing out, "is what happens when ordinary people refuse to look away. We cannot let this moment pass without demanding real change. Chief Reynolds has made promises, but promises mean nothing without action. It's up to us to hold him and everyone else accountable." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Clara stepped aside as another speaker took the microphone. Reynolds listened intently, his expression unreadable. He had always known the road to reform would be difficult, but hearing the anger and frustration in the voices of his neighbors drove the point home. When it was his turn to speak, Reynolds climbed the steps to the stage, his uniform stark against the colorful signs and banners. The applause was polite but cautious, a clear reflection of the crowd's mixed feelings. "Good evening," he began, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "I stand before you tonight as your police chief, but also as a father, a neighbor, and a man who has seen firsthand the flaws in the system I've sworn to uphold. Yesterday's incident was a wake-up call, not just for me, but for this entire department." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "I want to be clear. What happened to my son, Marcus, should never happen to anyone. It was a failure of judgment, a failure of training, and frankly, a failure of leadership. And that responsibility falls on me." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of agreement and curiosity about what he would say next. "I've heard the skepticism," Reynolds continued. "I know many of you think this is just another speech, another attempt to placate the community without making real changes. But I promise you, this time will be different. Today, I am announcing a series of reforms that will not only address bias and misconduct within the Brookhaven Police Department, but will also ensure transparency and accountability moving forward." He outlined his plan in detail: mandatory de-escalation training, body cameras for all officers, the formation of a civilian oversight committee, and the implementation of community policing initiatives designed to rebuild trust. Each point was met with a mix of applause and critical murmurs, the crowd unwilling to fully embrace his words until they saw results. After finishing his speech, Reynolds stepped down, rejoining Marcus near the edge of the stage. The two stood side by side, watching as the crowd continued to discuss and debate the future of their city. "You think they believe you?" Marcus asked quietly. Reynolds exhaled, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his answer. "Some do, some won't, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that we follow through." As the night wore on, the square began to empty, but the momentum of the movement continued to build. Social media lit up with clips from the press conference and the speeches, spreading the story far beyond Brookhaven. Activists from neighboring cities reached out, offering support and solidarity, while national media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a pivotal moment in the fight against systemic racism in policing. Meanwhile, within the department, the reaction was less unified. Many officers supported the chief's reforms, acknowledging the need for change in light of recent events. Others, however, bristled at what they saw as an attack on their profession, their resentment simmering just beneath the surface. Among them was Officer Carter, now suspended and awaiting the outcome of an internal investigation. Sitting in his small apartment, Carter watched the news coverage with growing unease. The video of his encounter with Marcus played on a loop, each replay chipping away at the fragile justifications he had clung to. For the first time, he began to question his actions, not just in this incident, but throughout his brief career. Across town, Marcus was having his own moment of reflection. Sitting in his room, surrounded by books and debate trophies, he stared at his laptop screen, where a draft of an essay for school remained unfinished. His thoughts kept returning to the voices he had heard in the square, the stories of others who had faced injustice without the privilege of having a police chief for a parent. He turned to his father, who was sitting on the couch, reviewing reports. "Dad," Marcus said, breaking the silence, "I want to do something. I can't just sit here while other people are out there fighting for change." Reynolds looked up, his expression softening. "You already are, Marcus. Just by speaking up, by sharing your story, you're making a difference. But if you want to do more, we'll find a way together." The conversation marked a turning point for both father and son. For Reynolds, it was a reminder of why he had chosen this career in the first place: to protect and serve, not to perpetuate harm. For Marcus, it was the beginning of a journey toward activism, a commitment to ensuring that what had happened to him would not happen to others. As Marcus begins to find his voice as an advocate, the challenges of enacting real reform come into sharper focus. Will the community rally behind Chief Reynolds' vision for change, or will resistance from within the department threaten his efforts? And how will Marcus navigate his growing role in the movement for justice? Stay with us for the next chapter and share your thoughts. What does real accountability look like to you? Let's discuss in the comments below. The morning after the press conference, Brookhaven's streets hummed with a sense of purpose. Posters adorned shop windows, each bearing a variation of the same message: justice for all, or change starts here. Conversations buzzed in coffee shops, barbershops, and community centers as residents debated what Chief Reynolds' promises would mean for their city. For some, his transparency was a breath of fresh air in an otherwise opaque system. For others, his connection to Marcus cast doubt on his ability to enact unbiased reforms. At the heart of the movement, Marcus found himself unexpectedly thrust into a spotlight he hadn't asked for. His face was on social media posts and news articles, accompanied by captions like, "The teen who sparked a movement." Initially, he bristled at the attention, feeling overwhelmed by the expectations suddenly placed on his shoulders. But as he read through messages from people across the country, some sharing their own experiences with injustice, others simply offering words of encouragement, he realized the potential for his story to amplify a larger conversation. That afternoon, Marcus attended a meeting at a local community center, organized by Clara Jenkins and other activists. The room was packed, the energy palpable as neighbors, students, and elders gathered to discuss their next steps. Clara stood at the front, her voice commanding but warm as she addressed the crowd. "We've all seen what happened," she began, "and we've all heard Chief Reynolds' promises. But promises don't mean anything unless we keep the pressure on. We need to hold him, the department, and the entire system accountable, not just today, but every day moving forward." Applause erupted, and Clara gestured toward Marcus, who sat near the front. "We're fortunate to have Marcus Reynolds here with us. He's not just a victim of what happened. He's a symbol of what we're fighting for. Marcus, would you like to say a few words?" Marcus hesitated, his palms damp as dozens of eyes turned toward him. Public speaking was nothing new to him, but this was different. This wasn't a debate tournament or a classroom assignment. This was real, and the stakes felt enormous. He stood slowly, clearing his throat as the room quieted. I never thought I'd be here," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves churning in his stomach. "When what happened to me first happened, all I wanted was for it to stop, for someone to see me as more than a suspect, as more than just a description." He paused, scanning the room. "But now I see that this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been treated like they don't matter. It's about fixing a system that's supposed to protect people, but too often ends up hurting them instead." The room erupted into applause, and Marcus continued, emboldened by their support. "I don't know what the future holds. I don't have all the answers, but I do know that if we work together, we can make sure this moment isn't just another story people forget about in a week. We can make it the start of something real." After the meeting, several attendees approached Marcus, shaking his hand and offering words of encouragement. Among them was a man in his 40s, dressed in a well-worn jacket. "You've got courage, kid," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "My son went through something similar last year. He didn't have a chief for a dad, though. It's good to see someone speaking up for kids like him." The man's words stayed with Marcus long after the meeting ended, fueling his resolve to do more. He returned home that evening and sat down with his father, the two of them poring over the plans for the department's new civilian oversight committee. Marcus was full of questions. How would members be selected? What powers would they have? How could the community ensure their voices were truly heard? Reynolds was impressed by his son's determination. "You know," he said, setting down his pen, "you're turning into quite the advocate. Maybe law school really is in your future." Marcus grinned faintly. The weight of the day momentarily lifted. "Maybe, but first we need to make sure these reforms actually happen." While father and son worked to push their plans forward, the ripple effects of the incident began to spread. Nearby cities reached out to Brookhaven, asking for guidance on implementing similar reforms. National organizations took note, offering resources and amplifying the story. Protesters gathered not just in Brookhaven, but in towns and cities across the state, each demonstration adding fuel to the growing movement. But the path forward was not without resistance. Within the police department, murmurs of dissent grew louder. Some officers viewed the reforms as an attack on their profession, resenting the increased scrutiny and oversight. Among the loudest critics was Officer Carter, who had become a polarizing figure within the department. Sitting in his small apartment, Carter scrolled through social media, his stomach twisting at the flood of comments condemning his actions. He felt cornered, defensive, but also uneasy as he replayed the incident in his mind. For the first time, he began to question not just what he had done, but why he had done it. What had driven him to react the way he had? Was it fear? Pride? Bias? Across town, Chief Reynolds faced his own challenges. Meetings with city officials and police unions were tense, each side pushing back against the other's demands. Some feared the reforms would go too far, undermining law enforcement's ability to do its job. Others argued the changes didn't go far enough, pointing to systemic issues that couldn't be fixed with training sessions and oversight committees alone. Despite the obstacles, Reynolds remained steadfast. Late one evening, after a particularly grueling negotiation session, he returned home to find Marcus waiting for him in the living room. "Long day?" Marcus asked, handing his father a glass of water. Reynolds sank into the couch, nodding. "It's like pulling teeth, trying to get everyone on the same page. But we're making progress. Slow but steady." Marcus sat beside him, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think people can really change? I mean, Carter, the other officers who don't want this. Do you think they'll ever see things differently?" Reynolds took a long sip of water before answering. "I think people can change, but it takes time, and sometimes it takes something personal. For me, it was seeing what happened to you. For Carter, who knows? Maybe this will be his wake-up call. Maybe it won't. But that doesn't mean we stop trying." Marcus nodded, his father's words settling over him like a challenge. If change was possible, it would take more than policy. It would take persistence, patience, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. As the movement grows, the stakes become higher for both the community and the Reynolds family. Will Chief Reynolds succeed in uniting a divided city, or will the backlash threaten his career? And how will Marcus navigate his new role as an advocate for justice? The answers lie ahead. Stay tuned and tell us, what does courage mean to you? Let's keep the conversation going in the comments below. Officer James Carter sat alone at the edge of his bed, his head buried in his hands. The dim glow of the television flickered across the room, but he wasn't watching. Instead, his mind churned, replaying every moment of his encounter with Marcus Reynolds. Each second haunted him, the sharp sting of Clara Jenkins' voice, the terrified look on Marcus's face, and the overwhelming realization that his actions had been wrong. For days, Carter had avoided looking too deeply at himself, but the mirror was unavoidable now. He reached for the stack of letters on his coffee table, sent from strangers across the city. Some contained harsh criticism, condemning him as a symbol of everything broken within law enforcement. Others were less expected letters of advice, urging him to confront his biases and learn from his mistakes. One in particular stood out, a handwritten note from a retired officer. "James, I've been where you are. Guilt can be a powerful teacher if you let it. This isn't about punishment, it's about growth. Take responsibility, but also take the opportunity to be better. The world doesn't need perfect officers, it needs humble ones." The words stayed with him as he stared at the badge on his nightstand. For the first time, he wondered if his career could be about more than control and authority. Across town, Marcus was grappling with his own questions. After days of meetings, speeches, and public appearances, he finally found a moment of solitude in the library. The space was quiet, the air filled with the faint smell of old books and freshly printed pages. He sat at a corner table, poring over articles on restorative justice and community policing. "What are you working on?" Clara Jenkins' voice pulled him from his thoughts. She slid into the chair across from him, her ever-present energy a stark contrast to the calm of the library. Marcus leaned back, running a hand through his hair. I'm trying to understand how we actually fix this. Not just my dad's department, but everything, the system, the culture, all of it. Clara smiled, her eyes softening. That's a big task for one person, kid, but it's a good place to start. Change happens when people like you start asking the right questions. Marcus tilted his head. But is it enough? I feel like no matter what we do, there's always going to be another Officer Carter out there. Someone who sees a kid like me and assumes the worst. Clara leaned forward, her voice low but firm. You're right. There will always be resistance. But every time we push back, we make it harder for those assumptions to go unchallenged. And sometimes, we even reach people we didn't think we could. Their conversation was interrupted by the buzz of Marcus's phone. It was a message from his father. Carter wants to meet with us. He asked for it. Are you ready? Marcus's heart raced. The idea of facing Carter again filled him with a mix of anger and curiosity. What could the man possibly want to say? After a moment's hesitation, he replied, "Let's do it." The meeting took place the next day in a small conference room at the police station. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. Chief Reynolds sat between Marcus and Carter, his expression neutral but watchful. Carter was the first to speak, his voice hesitant. I owe you both an apology. Marcus, what I did to you was wrong. There's no excuse for it. I didn't listen, I didn't think, and I let my own biases dictate my actions. Marcus studied him carefully, searching for sincerity. Why now? Why do you care about apologizing after everything that's happened? Carter's shoulders slumped, and he let out a deep sigh. Because I can't stop thinking about it. About how I looked at you and didn't see a person, I saw a suspect. And that's not who I want to be. I've been reading, listening, trying to understand where I went wrong. It's not enough, but I want to do better. Not just for you, but for everyone. The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Marcus spoke, his tone measured. Words are easy. What are you actually going to do? Carter met his gaze, his expression earnest. I'm enrolling in bias training. I'm volunteering with a community outreach program your dad mentioned. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to work with groups like the one Clara's organizing to listen, to learn, and to help where I can. Chief Reynolds broke his silence, his voice calm but firm. Carter, this is a start. But accountability isn't just about what you say, it's about what you do. Marcus doesn't owe you forgiveness, and neither does this community. If you want to earn back their trust, you have to show up. Every day. Carter nodded, his face resolute. I understand. For Marcus, the meeting was a strange mix of closure and beginning. He didn't forgive Carter, not yet, but he felt a flicker of hope that the man might truly change. As they left the room, Marcus turned to his father. Do you think he means it? Reynolds thought for a moment before answering. I think he wants to. Whether he does or not is up to him. The weeks that followed saw Carter making good on his promises. He attended community meetings, participated in training sessions, and began volunteering with youth programs designed to bridge the gap between police and the neighborhoods they served. At first, his presence was met with skepticism, but over time, his persistence began to chip away at the walls people had built around him. Meanwhile, Marcus threw himself into his advocacy work, partnering with Clara and other activists to push for broader reforms. Together, they organized workshops, rallies, and educational programs aimed at fostering dialogue and building trust. Slowly but surely, the community began to heal, not perfectly, but enough to inspire hope. One evening, as Marcus walked home from a meeting, he spotted Carter helping a group of kids plant flowers in a community garden. The sight was surreal, a reminder that even the most flawed individuals were capable of growth. For the first time, Marcus allowed himself to believe that change was possible, not just for Carter, but for Brookhaven and beyond. As Carter works to rebuild trust and Marcus continues his journey as an advocate, the seeds of change take root in Brookhaven. But will the momentum last, or will old habits and resistance threaten to undo their progress? Join us next time as we explore the ongoing battle for justice and the lessons it teaches us all. Share your thoughts. What does redemption mean to you? Let's discuss in the comments below. Months had passed since the incident that ignited Brookhaven's reckoning. The city had transformed into a hub of activism, discussion, and reform. Streets that once felt divided now teemed with collaborative energy community events. Police forums and volunteer projects dotted the calendar, all aimed at bridging the gaps that had fractured trust for so long. Marcus found himself at the center of this transformation. His voice now respected and sought after by activists, city leaders, and even national organizations. One particular day stood out as a milestone. Marcus had been invited to speak at a regional conference on law enforcement reform. The invitation came as a surprise. He was just a high school junior, after all. But Clara had insisted. "Your story is the reason this city is changing," she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "People need to hear it." Standing backstage at the event, Marcus felt the familiar tangle of nerves in his stomach. The auditorium was packed with leaders from across the state police chiefs, activists, educators, and elected officials, all waiting to hear what the teenager from Brookhaven had to say. His father stood nearby, offering quiet encouragement, while Clara squeezed his shoulder. "Remember," she whispered, "you're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for everyone who's ever been silenced." As Marcus stepped onto the stage, the lights were blinding, the audience a blur of indistinct faces. He took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium, and began. "Good afternoon. My name is Marcus Reynolds, and I'm here today because of something that shouldn't have happened, but did. Something that happens to too many people who look like me in too many places across this country." The room was silent as he recounted the events of that day, the confusion, the fear, the anger. He spoke not just of his own experience, but of the countless others who had faced similar injustices without the privilege of a police chief for a parent. "I'm not here to condemn every officer," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "I'm here to challenge a system that allows good intentions to be overshadowed by bad practices, fear, and bias. And I'm here to say that change isn't just possible, it's necessary." When he finished, the applause was thunderous, filling the auditorium with a wave of support. Marcus stepped off the stage, his chest heaving with a mix of relief and pride. His father was there to greet him, his expression one of quiet admiration. "You did good, son," Reynolds said simply, pulling him into a hug. The conference wasn't just a platform for Marcus. It was a springboard for Brookhaven's efforts to gain wider recognition. Other cities began adopting the reforms Chief Reynolds had implemented, from bias training to civilian oversight committees. The department's success became a case study in how transparency and accountability could coexist with effective policing. Meanwhile, Carter continued his path toward redemption. Though his progress was slow and often met with skepticism, he remained committed to proving himself. He became a regular presence at community events, participating in discussions and listening to the experiences of those he once alienated. One evening, while attending a workshop on restorative justice, he found himself seated across from Marcus. The two hadn't spoken much since their initial meeting, but Carter saw this as an opportunity to say something meaningful. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he began, his tone measured, "but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better, and I owe that to you, to what you went through." Marcus regarded him carefully, the memory of that day still vivid in his mind. "I don't forgive you," he said honestly. "Not yet, but I can see you're trying. That's a start." For Marcus, Carter's efforts were a reminder of the complexity of change. It wasn't linear, and it didn't come easily. But each step, no matter how small, mattered. It was a lesson he carried with him as he balanced school, advocacy, and the responsibilities that came with being a voice for justice. As Brookhaven's reputation grew, so did the movement it inspired. Protests in neighboring cities adopted the slogan, "Brookhaven Strong," a rallying cry for communities demanding similar reforms. National media outlets featured Marcus's story, framing it as a symbol of hope and perseverance. Yet, amid the accolades, Marcus remained grounded, thanks in large part to his father's steady presence. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Marcus shared his fears. What if all this doesn't last? What if it's just a moment, and people forget? Reynolds set down the report he'd been reviewing, his expression thoughtful. Movements don't last because of moments, Marcus. They last because of people. People like you who keep pushing even when it gets hard, even when it feels like no one's listening. That's how real change happens. Those words stayed with Marcus as he prepared for yet another meeting with activists and city leaders. This time, the agenda was ambitious. A statewide initiative to standardize law enforcement policies on bias and use of force. It was a daunting task, but Marcus approached it with the same determination that had carried him through every challenge so far. As the meeting began, Clara leaned over to him, her smile bright. "You ready for this?" Marcus nodded, his resolve clear. "Let's get to work." Brookhaven's story has sparked a wave of change, but the road ahead remains uncertain. Can the momentum of this movement be sustained? Or will old systems and attitudes threaten to derail progress? And how will Marcus and Chief Reynolds navigate the challenges of leading in a time of transformation? Stay tuned and let us know. What's your vision for a just and equitable society? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The momentum in Brookhaven seemed unstoppable, but as the weeks turned to months, the weight of progress began to reveal its challenges. Change, as Marcus and Chief Reynolds were learning, wasn't just about inspiring speeches and policy proposals. It was about persistence in the face of resistance. And resistance, while quieter now, was still very much alive. In the police department, tension simmered among some officers. The introduction of new protocols, particularly the mandatory body cameras and oversight committee reviews, was met with grumbles behind closed doors. A few officers voiced their concerns openly, framing the changes as unnecessary scrutiny that made their jobs harder. "We're being punished for doing our jobs," one officer said during a department meeting. "It's like we're guilty until proven innocent." Reynolds listened carefully before responding, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. Our job is to serve and protect all members of this community, not just some. If these changes feel uncomfortable, it's because we're challenging a system that's been comfortable with flaws for too long." Despite his words, the resistance lingered, particularly among older officers who viewed the reforms as an erosion of their authority. Rumors began circulating about a group within the department who were quietly lobbying against the chief's efforts, hoping to sway city officials into scaling back the changes. It was a reminder to Reynolds that even in the face of progress, old habits and entrenched attitudes didn't fade easily. Meanwhile, Marcus faced challenges of his own. His growing prominence as an advocate brought both praise and criticism. Social media, which had been a powerful tool in amplifying his voice, also became a space where detractors sought to undermine him. Anonymous comments accused him of exploiting his father's position for personal gain, while others dismissed his efforts as naive idealism. At first, Marcus tried to ignore the negativity, but it began to weigh on him. One evening, after reading through a particularly harsh thread of comments, he shut his laptop with a frustrated sigh. His father, noticing his mood, sat down beside him. "What's going on?" Reynolds asked gently. Marcus hesitated before speaking. "It feels like no matter what I do, someone's always going to say it's not enough, or that I don't deserve to be doing it at all." Reynolds nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's the nature of leadership, son. When you stand for something, there will always be people who try to tear you down. But remember, the people who matter, the ones you're fighting for, see you for who you really are. Don't let the noise drown out your purpose." Bolstered by his father's words, Marcus refocused his energy. He threw himself into his work, organizing workshops for young people in Brookhaven and traveling to neighboring cities to share his story. At one such workshop, he met a group of teenagers who had started their own initiative to address racial bias in schools. Their passion reminded Marcus of why he had started this journey, and their stories inspired him to keep pushing forward. Back in Brookhaven, Clara Jenkins was leading her own efforts to sustain the movement. She had begun coordinating with local business owners, clergy, and educators to create a coalition that could advocate for change across multiple sectors of the community. The coalition, called Brookhaven United, quickly became a powerful force, bringing together people from all walks of life to tackle issues ranging from economic inequality to education reform. One evening, during a coalition meeting, Clara stood before the group, her voice resolute. This movement started with a single incident, but it's grown into something much bigger. It's about more than just policing. It's about building a community where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. And that means we need to stay united, even when the road gets tough. The coalition's work didn't go unnoticed. Media outlets began reporting on Brookhaven United's efforts, framing the city as a model for grassroots activism and systemic reform. But the increased attention also brought new challenges. State legislators, some of whom were wary of Brookhaven's progressive approach, began proposing bills that could undermine the reforms Chief Reynolds had implemented. Faced with these obstacles, Marcus, Clara, and the coalition rallied the community to push back. They organized town hall meetings, launched letter-writing campaigns, and flooded social media with messages urging residents to contact their representatives. Their efforts paid off when the proposed bills were tabled, a testament to the power of collective action. Despite these victories, Marcus knew the work was far from over. He often found himself reflecting on a conversation he'd had with Carter during one of their community workshops. Carter, now a regular presence at such events, had shared his own struggles with the process of unlearning his biases. "It's not easy," Carter admitted. "Every day, I have to confront things I didn't even realize were a part of me. But seeing the impact this work has on the community, it makes it worth it." Marcus had nodded, appreciating Carter's honesty. "It's not just about you," he said. "It's about the people who see you trying. If they can see someone like you change, maybe they'll believe they can too." The memory of that conversation stayed with Marcus as he prepared for Brookhaven's first annual Day of Unity, an event designed to celebrate the progress the city had made and recommit to the work ahead. The event featured speeches, performances, and a march through the city's main streets, culminating in a ceremony at the town square. As Marcus stood on the stage that evening, looking out at the diverse crowd gathered before him, he felt a surge of hope. The faces staring back at him, young and old, black and white, police officers and civilians, were a testament to the power of collective effort. "Brookhaven isn't perfect," Marcus began, his voice clear and steady. "But tonight, we're here to celebrate how far we've come and to remind ourselves of how far we still have to go. This isn't the end of our story, it's just the beginning." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the square as the night sky lit up with fireworks. For Marcus, it was a moment of affirmation, a reminder that change was possible, not because of any one person, but because of the collective strength of a community united in purpose. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey through Brookhaven's story, a tale of accountability, redemption, and the unyielding fight for justice. Stories like these remind us that change begins with each of us, in our communities, and in the choices we make every day. If this story moved you, inspired you, or even made you think differently, don't let the conversation end here. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of changemakers who believe in fairness, compassion, and the power of collective action. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of this story resonated with you the most? Drop a comment below and share your insights. Your voice matters. Let's reflect together. And if you believe in the power of unity, write something inspiring like, "I stand for justice, compassion, and lasting change." There's so much more to explore. Check out our other videos for more stories that challenge, inspire, and spark important conversations. Together, we can create a ripple effect that reaches far beyond what we ever imagined. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and remember, every step toward justice matters.